Okay, so now let's talk about feedback. Let's talk about providing immediate, specific feedback and maintaining a brisk pace. And we're going to talk first about the feedback piece here. So the objectives for this part are 1, to understand why it's important to provide immediate, specific feedback, and 2, how to provide immediate, specific feedback. So we'll talk about those pieces. In terms of DBI framework, this is obviously one of our different ways we can adapt our instruction as part of explicit instruction. So there are multiple different aspects of explicit instruction. There's modeling, practice, and supporting practices. And then within supporting practices, one particular way you can increase the use of explicit instruction principles is to provide more immediate, specific feedback. So the checklist for this is quite simple. There needs to be 2 things. Guess. Immediate, and 2, specific. So those are the things that are really critical here. As we said, engagement is focusing students on the lesson content. And we want to provide students feedback as quickly as possible after they give a response so that they know whether or not their responses are correct, so they know whether or not they're on track. And here we can do it in 2 different ways. 1, with a discrete task, a very short task, something that only takes a few seconds. You can give very immediate feedback within a few seconds. Sometimes with a complex task like writing a paragraph, you might not be able to provide feedback as immediately in the same way, but we want to do it as soon as possible. So immediate might not mean in the next couple seconds. Why is it important to provide this immediate feedback? Well, this allows you to make it clear to students what you expect to do. It particularly prevents students from misunderstanding what it is you're trying to teach them. What happens really frequently is that students don't get it. And what do you think happens? And you may have seen this before. What happens when students don't understand something and the lesson goes on? Well, you might be thinking a couple things. One thing is they start to tune out. Students who struggle, who have what often we call learned helplessness, students who need intensive intervention, often have learned that the best thing to do is just to give up. And when it gets hard, they give up. So if they practice incorrectly and they don't understand, they just give up. The other thing that happens when students are incorrect is if they want to stick with the lesson, they just sort of make it up. They sort of just figure, well, I don't know what the real answer is, but I'm just going to guess that it's this. And then they have this inaccurate information stuck in their head. So you have to provide that immediate feedback so that information is not stuck in their head. By providing the immediate feedback, you can move more quickly towards student mastery because students are keeping with you. And again, as we talked about, if you did module 6, you know that we need to have a high rate of accuracy throughout this. So when you're giving feedback, 80% of the time as you're doing guided practice or as you're doing your model, 80% of the time that should be correct. And you should be giving positive feedback. If the feedback is not positive, hopefully it's only 20% of the time. And so by giving lots of feedback, you'll increase the rate with which students will master the concepts because they'll be able to show you and they'll be able to be confident that they're understanding each piece as they go on to the next one. So ultimately, this ensures successful learning. That's about the immediate piece. What do we mean by specific? We want to tie it directly to students' actions, meaning we're not just talking about it in general, like saying good or something like that. Although we often say good, and that's okay to do. You should tell students good. But more frequently, most of the time, you want to say what about something was good, okay? The reason you need to do that is because it allows you to make sure your expectations are very clear. If you don't tell students exactly what it is they did correctly, they may not be aware. When you say good, they may not have any clue what it was that was good about what they did. And that can lead to a lot of misunderstandings with students if you aren't specific about it. And so you're showing students the expectations that you have for them so they'll do the good thing more often. But if you just say, it's pretty good, then that doesn't do that for students. Specific feedback also removes ambiguity. It also makes clear like exactly what you mean. Sometimes there are gradations of things where they got part of something right and you want to emphasize something that they got right. And particularly in a math problem, you might say something like, you did a great job with labeling your answer. You wrote a complete sentence for your answer. If you just say good, student might think, oh, it's great. I got the right numbers in there. They don't necessarily know what it is you're focusing on. So you create a lot of ambiguity. And again, being specific results in more successful learning. So there are different types of responses that we're going to talk about here. So one is, for example, the student says, you ask, what is 8 times 5? That's the prompt you give to the students. And however you do that, we're not specifying here. Student response is 40, and that's correct. So that would be a case where you would provide affirmative feedback. Another answer might be 85, which would be incorrect, and then you're going to provide corrective feedback. And then finally, you're going to have cases where the answer is off topic or so far outside of correct that it's not going to really work to provide students with correct or incorrect feedback. You just need to reset. So again, kind of summarizing what I just said is when students are correct, you give them affirmative feedback. When they're incorrect, you give them corrective feedback. And when they're off topic, you do what I like to call reset feedback. And to be clear, I sort of just made that term up. I just think about it as like resetting students' cognitive processing. Like, no, let's do it this different way. But in a really positive way. You're not going to say, no. That is not going to be reinforcing for students. You want to do something very positive, but you're going to reset their understanding. The feedback is going to be aligned to the response in the way that we just described. So if it's affirmative, you give an affirmative response. If it's correct, you do something like, great job, 8 times 5 does equal 40. And that is what? That's affirmative. If the student is incorrect, then you would say the answer is 85. Then you would say that's incorrect. So we say 8 times 5 equals 40. What does 8 times 5 equal? Our feedback is then we are giving the students the correct answer here so they can get the corrective feedback. So that's corrective. Then finally, if the student says multiply, that's an off-task, or not off-task, but off-topic answer. It's not related to the exact content. And so then we give reset feedback where we are multiplying. Let me ask the question a different way. What's the product of 8 times 5? And that's that reset feedback that I talked about. So I want you to think about these things in your own experience because no doubt you have done these kinds of things in a classroom. If you've provided affirmative feedback, you provided corrective feedback, and you've reset students from time to time. So think about an example where you have in a classroom implemented these things and done each of those 3 things to give you sort of a mental framework for what does this look like in classrooms. So go ahead and stop and jot and write those things down, and we'll come back together and we'll talk more about those strategies specifically. Okay, presumably you had a chance to talk about your classroom, think about your classroom. It's important you do that so you have a mental framework for what you've done in the past and how what you've done might be changed or enhanced by some of the work we're about to do. So strategies for affirmative feedback, corrective feedback, and reset feedback all differ, and we'll talk about each of these. So with affirmative feedback, we're going to talk about reinforcing and restating. That's going to be one of our key strategies here. I'm going to talk with you about some do's and don'ts about giving affirmative feedback. Affirmative feedback is important to do immediately, and as we talked about, immediate could mean literally immediately or could mean after a period of time. You want to show your positivity in more than one way. Use affirmative actions, thumbs up, nodding, sort of moving your body in an affirmative kind of way to show your positive feeling about things. Smile. You want to praise malleable factors. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but there are whole classes on the importance of getting students to praise things that they can actually change. So if you tell students that they're doing well in terms of effort, that they've been working hard, for example, that will result in them putting more effort because you praise them not for getting the answer correct, but for the effort that they put in. And this is really important to do. As you provide that specific feedback, it should be specific to the content. Certainly you can provide feedback about somebody keeping their chair on the floor or something like that, but as much as possible, you want your feedback to be focused on the lesson content. And you want to always be praising how a student is improving relative to themselves. When you work with students who need intensive intervention, they may be several grade levels below. And if they are, then we need to meet them where they are and talk about their level of performance currently and how they are doing relative to where they started. And we want to go right from there. We don't want to tell students they're smart. That's the opposite of praising malleable factors because intelligence, students don't perceive as changeable. They cannot change how smart they are. They can change how hard they work. They can't change how hard they are, how smart they are. And so actually, when you provide positive feedback about kids being smart, it's actually harmful. I can't stress enough how important that is, that telling students they're smart, even though you are attempting to make them feel better about themselves, the long-term implications of that are not positive, because often, even if you say it, students don't feel that way. And even if they feel that way in that moment, they're going to encounter times when they don't get the right answer. If the only reason they didn't get the right answer was because, or they would get the answers because they're smart and they get it wrong, then that must mean what? They're not smart. And so we need to avoid telling students they're smart. You're going to want to praise, what is it? Effort, not intelligence. Second, you only want to praise students when they actually do hard work. So if you're not so sure students actually met the expectations that you set, then you need to talk with them, give them praise for meeting the expectations. If they aren't meeting the expectations, that doesn't mean you say bad things. You're going to provide corrective feedback in a positive way, but you don't want to give them praise for things that weren't actually praiseworthy. And of course, when you're providing feedback that's positive, don't just say good job, say something substantive. But I will say that it's really hard not just to say good job from time to time. Students like just being told that things are going well, and that's fine to do. I know that I do it in my own teaching, but as much as possible, I try to be specific about it. So let's talk about how you can use this strategy of delivering feedback in a positive way. So I'm going to talk about polygons here. So a little math example here. So this is a polygon. Does anyone know what polygon that is? It's written on the slide. So perhaps you remember from geometry, 6 sides. Hex, I think, means 6. And so hexagon is a 6-sided polygon. And so in this case, the question the teacher asked is, what polygon is this? And the answer is correct. And the answer is, yes, that's a hexagon. All right, the student says, that's a hexagon. And then the positive feedback, the affirmative feedback is, you're right, that's a hexagon. It's a reinforce and restate because it's reinforcing because we're saying that it's correct, and it's restating it by saying the answer again. There's nothing wrong with saying the answer again. It just gets it in the students' heads one more time, and that's a good thing to do. So now let's look at a short video example of this, and we can actually see how the teacher used the affirmative feedback.
What is the first step you would take in solving this equation?
Add 3 to each side of the equation to start simplifying it?
Yes, you would add 3 to each side of the equation.
Okay, so she reinforced and restated. She reinforced by saying yes, and she restated by repeating the correct answer to the question. So perhaps you didn't do it in quite the same way. You might have said great. You might have said something else that you thought was really reinforcing and positive for the student. And you would not have said what? What's one thing you would not have said? If you're thinking that you would not have said, you're so smart, that would be the right answer. You do not want to encourage students to think about this as being intelligence-based rather effort-based. So one thing I might say here is, I like how hard you worked on that, or how hard you thought about that, which reinforces the idea that if you work hard at it, you can do better at it. So this is a nice way to reinforce by saying yes and restate by saying it again. And think for a second, why is it that we emphasize the restating of this? Why not just reinforce with a yes? We talked about this, but sort of remind yourself about that for a second. I hope you're thinking that we restate to get it in students' minds one more time. So remember that thinking about the way that we've talked about engagement before, we want to maximize cognitive processing. And one way to do that is to restate things so students have another opportunity to hear the correct information. So there is a good example of how to reinforce and restate. And suddenly, I appear on this side. Okay. So we talked about affirmative feedback, reinforcing, restating. It's a very simple but powerful way to remind students of the correct information and to reinforce it by giving them praise. So now let's talk about corrective feedback. And use corrective feedback when? Presumably you're thinking when something is incorrect and you need to help students with that. There are 3 ways of doing this. You say it, they repeat it, give the answer and give a choice, and revoicing. And so we'll talk about all 3 of those methods. So let's talk about first some general principles of corrective feedback. And I want to spend a moment talking about each of these because I think it's important for you to understand why we emphasize these things. So first, we want to explain the skill or strategy the student is missing. Why do that? Because the point of corrective feedback is not simply to correct the student's response and get them to give you the correct response. The goal is that this is an opportunity for them to reinforce the correct answer, to reinforce the learning that they're doing. You then definitely want to prompt the student to answer the question again correctly. And you want to set the student up for success with that. So even though it may seem silly to say the correct answer and then ask the student immediately what is the correct answer, that gives them an opportunity to experience success, an opportunity to get the right information in their brain, an opportunity for you to reinforce them for getting the right answer. That's a very important part of this because it keeps students focused on getting the right information, and they have a positive experience even when they have a correction. You also want to explain why the correct response is correct. You want to do these things in a very short and abbreviated way because you could go on and on sometimes about why something is correct, and that's not a good idea. You want to keep it short and simple, but you want to explain also often why the right answer is the right answer. Always, of course, you want to use a positive tone. By positive tone, I mean sort of verbal tone, but I also mean tone and affect in a general way, using body language like nodding and smiling to indicate that you're interested in the student's response and that you want to support them in getting the right answer, and that there's no problem with getting the wrong answer. And so, of course, your tone wants to be positive also. You want to be sort of like focused on like, we're going to get the right stuff here. It's all about that. It's not about judging the student for getting it wrong. So it's really critical to be positive. And finally, you want to model that correct response, which links back to explaining why the correct response is correct and explaining the skill and strategy. So you can actually model that correct response for them so that when they are asked to repeat it, they'll be able to do it well. The don'ts here, the first is obvious. Don't just say that they're wrong. What's a problem with just telling students that they're wrong? So just for a second, think about if you just tell students they're wrong, what are a couple problems with that? Some of which we've discussed and some that we haven't. Well, I hope you thought to yourself that telling a student they're wrong is a very punishing thing to do, a very negative thing for you to do for them. And when I say punishing, I mean something that's likely to decrease their interest in that behavior in the future. So if you give them negative feedback, that's only going to reduce their interest in giving an answer next time when they're concerned that you are going to give them that same negative feedback again. So if you want students to participate consistently, never get in the situation where you're just going to tell them that they're wrong. Second, it's also really important not to perseverate on the student's error. And by this I mean you don't want to spend a lot of time, for example, and I've done this, telling the student, it's okay that you got the wrong answer, like you were on the right track, just a little bit different if you had just said this kind of thing. And I've spent as long as 30 seconds trying to make a student feel better about the incorrect response. And I'm guessing that some of you have done that too, and you sort of have this moment where you're like, how do I make them feel okay about this? My experience has been that the worst thing to do is to spend a lot of time talking to the student about it for a number of reasons that you can imagine. One, it just prolongs the student's interaction with you where they're feeling like they're incorrect. Two, it's giving them an interaction with their peers that might feel uncomfortable where you're spending all this time talking about excusing the mistake, and that might actually raise in their peers a thought about how oh, the student made a mistake, and might make that more apparent to the rest of the class. Whereas if you just move on quickly, that doesn't happen. So avoid these don'ts. And the second don't here is the one that you really need to think about. The first you're unlikely to do, but you might do this, and you want to make sure not to try to make the student feel okay. Help them in this way, and it'll all go well. So with that, let's talk about the different strategies for corrective feedback. First, let's talk about you say it, they repeat it. So we talked about the polygon example before, so I'll walk you through it here. You can read along with me. What polygon is this? And in italics here, the directions, point to the hexagon on the board, so I will be the teacher and do that. And then over here, the student says a pentagon, which is not correct. Remember, we talked about this is six-sided, that's a hexagon. So we could say, for example, you say it, they repeat it. I say, this is a hexagon, what polygon is it? And then the student immediately repeats a hexagon. And then you say, right, this polygon is a hexagon because it has 6 sides. So what have you done here? You've done a number of things. One, you've immediately corrected the response so that the student isn't sort of confused about this for the long term. 2, you've immediately given them the correct answer. 3, you've given them an opportunity to be correct because you said the right here. And 4, you've explained the right answer by talking here about the nature of a hexagon. That's a good example of you say it, they repeat it. And that ends up being affirmative feedback because now you're also restating the answer. So we turn that into a really great experience of corrective and then affirmative. Okay, so let's now take an opportunity to see how this would happen in practice. We're focusing here on you say it, they repeat it. So let's watch this video of Natasha Axelson working with a student and doing the corrective feedback using you say it, they repeat it. So watch the beginning of this clip.
What's the square root of 64?
4.
Okay, so that's over here. And now your task in the workbook is to figure out what should she say. So write in your workbook the answer you think is correct, and then I'll come back and we can talk about the answer together. Okay, so now let's see what she does.
What's the square root of 64?
4.
The square root of 64 is 8. What is the square root of 64?
8.
Okay, so she has done here this you say it, they repeat it. So what has she done? The student gave an incorrect response. She told the student the correct response, and she asked the student to repeat it. What else could she have done here that she did not do? Think about that for a second. Maybe you even wrote it in your workbook. I might add here some more positive feedback where the student says the right answer, and then one more time I get to say the explanation of the correct answer. So I might say, what is the square root of 64? And the student says, now 8. I say, that's right. Square root of 64 is 8. One more time. Another opportunity for the student to experience success and get that reinforcing feedback of your praise and to get in their heads one more time. So that's a nice example of you say it, they repeat it. Okay, so now let's look at another example. This time we're doing give the answer and give a choice. This one's a little more complicated than the first one, which was relatively simple. So I'm going to walk you through this pretty carefully. We've got a shape here, which you may recall as a hexagon. So what polygon is this? You point to the hexagon. The student says a pentagon. Okay, so now here's what you need to do. You want to start with something that you know is correct in what the student said. So often I say, I agree. So I might say, I agree the pentagon is a polygon. Now, then I need to address specifically the difference between the student's answer and the correct answer. A pentagon has 5 sides. A hexagon has 6 sides. And then what I do is I give the student 2 choices. One, the answer that they gave me, and the other, the correct answer, to give them an opportunity to distinguish these things. So it's a little bit more cognitively involved than just giving them the correct answer. They now have to think just a little bit more about the difference between their answers, and it will give them an opportunity to think. And sometimes you might find they don't say the thing you expected the second time. They go right back to their old answer, which suggests that when you were going through this process, they weren't fully cognitively processing the content. And that just might happen, and that might be okay, and we'll do it one more time. So really useful to ask that choice question. And then, again, right here at the end, yes, this polygon is a hexagon. I could even add here one more nice sentence. What could I add here? You can imagine it. I'm sure now that we've done the previous one, you can think about what it could be. So I might say here, a hexagon is a 6-sided polygon, reinforcing this idea about a hexagon having 6 sides that was fundamental to the student's misunderstanding. Okay, so, and then again, this is affirmative feedback here. So let's take a look at a video of Natasha Axelson one more time, doing another video here, this time in science and working with the same student. So let's go ahead and look at what she does when the student gives a response. So look at the video, and then we'll have a chance for you to think about what you would say. So let's do it.
What is the chemical symbol for sodium?
NaCl.
Okay, so that's not correct. The correct answer is Na. I'm pretty sure that's what sodium is. And so now, what is it that the teacher should be saying in response if we're using the give the answer and give a choice? And this is going to take a little more effort on your part, a little more cognitive processing on your part to think this one through. So you might want to look back at the previous slide to give you a picture of how that could look. So go ahead and do that now, and then we'll see how Natasha responds. Okay, so let's take a look. How does Natasha respond?
What is the chemical symbol for sodium?
NaCl.
The chemical symbol for sodium is Na. Is the chemical symbol for sodium Na or NaCl?
Na.
Okay, so here you saw Natasha do this kind of a corrective response. Now, there's one part I might have added to what she did. What was the first thing that you saw in the hexagon example? The first thing you saw was the agreement part, where the teacher found something in the answer that was correct. And so we might say, what could you say here? I can imagine I might say, I agree that sodium is in the formula NaCl, which is salt. But sodium is a chemical symbol for Na, or the chemical symbol for sodium is Na. So now I'm beginning with the agreement piece, which isn't here. And that's okay, you don't always have to do that, but it's a nice way to give an answer and then give the choice. And so now the student has an opportunity to get the correct response, okay? So nice example of give the answer and give a choice. And what I like about these examples is they're not entirely perfect. And that's exactly what we want to see, is that we can always improve our practice a little bit. This is an excellent teacher working with a student who's getting a lot of correct responses but still needs a little support. And now we have an opportunity to see how that works with her, and we can think about how to help her, an accomplished teacher, improve her practice, just like I'm sure you can improve as well. So the last corrective feedback strategy is something we're going to call ReVoicing. And it's a pretty simple strategy. What it does with ReVoicing is it gets the student an opportunity to hear what it was that they said and to try to correct it. So we're going to talk here about Corduroy, who is a little bear with missing suspenders. You may remember from, it's quite an old story, but it's very popular, about first, second grade, and he's a very cute teddy bear who gets lost in a department store. It's a little strange, but this is how it is. And in this story, he lost a button on his overalls, okay? So you can see here the answer is incorrect. So here we go. Why did Corduroy feel sad? Teacher asked this question, and perhaps he's working one-on-one with the student, so we get an individual student response. It says, he felt sad because he lost his shoe. Now, this is incorrect, but there is a lost piece here. And so the student is sort of on the right track, and so maybe we can think about what it was that he lost by repeating to the student what we just said, what the student just said. I hear you saying that Corduroy felt sad because he lost his shoe. Is that what you mean? So now the student has an opportunity to hear us talk about the feeling sad because he lost his shoe. And if the student was able to process the content, they may recall that in fact, it wasn't a shoe. And then the student says, oh no, he lost a button, which is why the overalls were falling off. And then the teacher is able to give affirmative feedback. That's one good reason why he was sad. And the teacher would say, you're so smart. No, the teacher would not say, you're so smart. As we have discussed, the teacher would say, I like how you thought about that, how you figured out what the right answer was. So that's a thing you can do, is you can like how I thought very hard about it, but not that we were smart. So forgive me for doing that, but I just wanted to reinforce the point. We're not going to tell students they're smart. So that, and again, at the end, is affirmative feedback. So let's go ahead now and watch a video of Natasha doing this with the student. So watch the video, and then we'll think about what she might say.
So Yelith, what is an equation that equals 20?
4 and 4 and 4 and 4 and 4 equals 20.
Okay, so now, what do you think is the right response? In your workbook, come up with what you think might be a good way to revoice this example. So go ahead and do that now. So now, let's get an opportunity to see what she does say. Let's look.
So Yelith, what is an equation that equals 20?
4 and 4 and 4 and 4 and 4 equals 20.
So what I hear you saying is that 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 equals 20. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, 4 times 5 equals 20.
Okay, so this is a really interesting example. So the teacher starts off with what's an equation that equals 20? And the student says the following, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4 is 20. What's interesting about that is that the student doesn't say equals. The student doesn't say plus. So the student does not use language that indicates the use of an equation. When the teacher revoices it, she actually uses the other language. And so she actually helps the student figure that out. then the student ends up saying a multiplication equation. So it's a little bit tricky because if I were the teacher, I might have done it a little bit differently. So first of all, it's not clear what the learning objective was here. And if we knew that, it would help us a little bit. So the teacher says, what's an equation that equals 20? As long as the student says plus and equals, like the teacher actually revoiced, then it's actually a fine equation. But if the teacher wanted multiplication, the teacher might say, what's an equation involving multiplication that equals 20? And so that would have resulted in, perhaps if the student said the 4 and 4 and 4 and 4 and 4, the teacher would say, what I hear you saying is this, and is that what you're saying? The student might say, oh yeah, but I mean 4 times 5. And so now they are clued into the fact that it's multiplication. So I might have handled this a little bit differently. And just like I said, these are great examples because not everything's perfect, and we get an opportunity to think about it a little bit further. So that's a nice example of teachers actually doing it in action. Now let's talk about how this might work in a program. So this is a program example. And programs often contain specific correction procedures for delivering corrective feedback. That's not true of all programs, but some particularly very good programs that provide students with very good explicit instruction already, they will include a correction procedure that you can follow in order to provide the kind of corrective feedback we're talking about. So for example, if in this particular program it says know the sound, and then you repeat the sound, point and hold under continuous sound for 2 to 3 seconds, point and tap under stop sound. That sounds very complicated. But what this is telling the teacher to do is what to say to know the sound, and then it gives the teacher very specific instruction, which doesn't make sense probably all the way to you. I did this program a long time ago, so I don't quite remember myself, but it doesn't matter because basically what it's doing, and the point here is that it's giving you very specific instructions for what to do. So, and then it continues on with the next steps in the same correction procedure. So this is a lengthy description of what would actually take only a few seconds, because here's what the teacher says, and here is what the teacher does, which is a lot more language. So I really like this example because this is an example of a program giving very clear and specific directions about what kind of correction you're going to give. So it's a great example of how to use correction. Okay. Now let's go on to our final type of feedback, which is reset feedback. And this is a really interesting one because this is not one you always hear talked about. This is one that I've sort of thought of over time I think is particularly helpful. Reset feedback can be helpful in a couple of ways. One, it can be helpful to stop a long response. And two, it can be helpful to ask the question a different way, particularly when you've made a mistake in figuring it out. The idea of reset feedback is to start things over, reset, right? And so, first thing you need to do is, a lot of times with reset feedback, we're trying to get things back on track. And often, one important thing we need to do is make sure the student is actually off topic when they're giving us a response that's quite long. So we want to think as they're talking, are they trying to get back to the concepts in the lesson? If they are, you might shape it a little bit, and I'll say more about that in a second. But if it's really off topic, you want to stop it, and I'll talk about how to do that in a moment. You always want to use a positive tone when you are resetting the feedback, and I'll describe again more about this in a second. You want to validate the degree which the answer is on track, if you can, and then you want to prompt the student to answer the question correctly if they can do that with the kind of thing that they're doing. You don't want to cut a student off when you're resetting the feedback too early, or assume the student isn't paying attention when they give you a response that's very much off topic. So when you do the reset feedback, it's important that you're very careful about the way you do it. One way to think about resetting is that what you're attempting to do here is to do the same kind of thing that a radio talk show host does. I don't know if you ever listen to talk radio, but I find it very stressful to listen to sports radio. And the reason is that they invite callers to call in, and you have no idea, they have no idea what the caller is about to say. And some comments are very perspicacious, meaning thoughtful. And some of the comments are not so perspicacious. They're very, very complicated. They're way off topic. And what I notice happening on those radio shows is the commentators often are stuck. They have no idea how to respond to the teacher, or not the teacher, to the caller. They just get stuck. It's almost like they're blind, and they don't have a way to reset. What you need to do is develop a skill set of helping students reset by stopping them in some way. And I'm going to talk to you about some ways that you can do that. On this slide, I have an example of a way that you could do that. So here is an example. What polygon is this? You point the hexagon. The student starts to talk. I'm not totally sure. I think I know what it might be. So it has 6 sides, and you're concerned the student is going to continue on for a long time and not get to the right answer. So one way to handle that is to say something like, let's get someone to help us. Now, what you want to do when you do this is you want to interject in a very gentle way. One way that I do that to help students recognize that I want them to stop, but not make it feel like I'm sort of like telling them stop, what I do is I sort of reach my hand out, and I actually step forward, and I actually lean back a little bit. And the reason I do it that way is I want to reinforce for the student, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong. I'm just sort of like gently telling them to stop for just a second. I'm leaning back because it's a less sort of aggressive posture. I'm showing some deference to the student and that what they're saying might be valuable, but I want to sort of like slow it down and stop it for a second. My experience is that students respond to that pretty well. My experience is also that students don't feel upset when I do this kind of thing if I do it in a gentle way, okay? It's important, though, to be careful about when you do it, so students aren't sort of negatively punished by you sort of prematurely cutting them off and making them feel uncomfortable about it. But if you can do it well, you can stop a long response in this way. And it's really important to be able to stop those long responses because, as I'm sure you have experienced, sometimes students just start talking. This is not a long response, but you have seen and you have stood there for at least a minute before and wondered how you could possibly stop the student from talking. And you have no idea how to do it. And I have been there. And that's why I recommend this process to you, the lean back, hand forward, and gentle language, because I found it's an appropriate way to stop these long responses that could go on for a long time. Even if the student is mid-sentence, you're able to do it as long as it appears gentle and not difficult for the student. So I will put my glasses back on because I'm now sort of zen about this experience I've had, I'm sure you've had, that's really challenging. So that's a good example of how to do that. So let's see how Natasha deals with this when she gets the same response from the student. So let's listen as she sets this up. And then again, as usual, you'll have an opportunity to think about how you respond in your workbook. So go ahead.
So Yeleth, what is a major theme in To Kill a Mockingbird?
Well, there are a lot of major themes because the characters are really complicated. And I mean, Atticus is a lawyer, so he likes to help people.
Okay, so you've got the sense of the student is sort of meandering here, not quite sure how to get to the theme. Maybe has forgotten this, it wasn't fully cognitively processed. So now write in your workbook, how would you handle this in a thoughtful way that you could use to stop this long response that's not entirely on topic? So go ahead and write that now. Okay, hopefully you've had a nice opportunity to reflect in your workbook. And now let's take a look at how Natasha actually responded to this.
What is a major theme in To Kill a Mockingbird?
Well, there are a lot of major themes because the characters are really complicated. And I mean, Atticus is a lawyer, so he likes to help people, and all the characters have their ways of doing things.
Okay, so let's ask someone to help us with that.
Okay, so you saw a nice thing that she did here, which is that she patiently waited, listened to the student. She nodded actually before she interjected, and this was a sort of student who is sort of willing to accept that feedback, and many students are, and so the teacher then went on to saying, let's get someone to help us. That's not the only thing you could say. You could say other things like, you could even say something like, hang on a second, or let me stop you there for a second. Something that's gentle and not sort of like stop, and sort of feels like rawr, but you have an opportunity to sort of just gently get the students to say it. So one thing that I've developed over time are strategies for how do I gently get students to stop talking. And so I found a number of ways that work for me. You'll have to find your own ways to reset and stop those long responses. So now let's look at the last one of these, which is asking the question a different way as a way to reset. And this is a situation in which you realize you haven't been clear, or you realize that you could rephrase something in order to make it clear to the student. Even if you said it clearly, maybe there's another way to say the same thing. So here we say, the question I ask is, what important thing should we say about this shape? Now my goal here is to find the number of sides in a pentagon, but, that is not a pentagon, on a hexagon. But what I can tell you here is that the question I ask sort of gives the student an opportunity to say lots of other things. And in this case, it's green, it's pretty big, it's symmetrical. Those are all true things. So now how do I reset by realizing I made a mistake? And so I say here, those things are true. Let me ask a more specific question. What is the name of this polygon? And now I'm going to get the answer that I want, which is it's the hexagon. So this is a good example of sort of like putting it on you. I find a lot of times it's really helpful for students if I take responsibility for some misunderstandings that they have, often because it is my fault. I get confused, I sort of say things the wrong way, I sort of trip over my words, and so as you have noticed, I do from time to time, maybe often. And so when I trip over my words, I need to make sure that I don't sort of put in a situation where the student is having to deal with that, and they're in that awkward space of like, I don't know what to say. And I'm sure that you've experienced that before, where students are sort of like, I don't know how to answer that. You weren't able to express it in a clear way. And so you need to sort of start over, and it's just sort of say, take responsibility for it. Hang on, let me say that a different way. Something you can do to sort of let the student know there's a different way I could express this. It's not on them, it's on you, and you can fix that for them. So now let's look at an example again of Natasha doing this with a student. So let's watch the video, and then you'll have an opportunity in your workbook, and then we'll come back together.
When we think about the Washington Monument, what should we remember about it?
Well, it's really tall, like over 500 feet, and the elevator gets used a lot. So it sometimes has trouble, and they're closing it to fix it.
Okay. So a little bit hard to do here because you don't actually know what she was intending for the student to say. So we'll see in a second. But you could imagine that particular question that you might want to ask of the student about the Washington Monument if you had a specific idea in mind. So think about what you could ask that might be more specific, and think about how you would phrase that for the student, taking responsibility for it yourself. So go ahead and write that in your workbook, and then we'll come back together and you'll have a chance to see what she does. Okay, so let's see what she says.
When we think about the Washington Monument, what should we remember about it?
Well, it's really tall, like over 500 feet, and the elevator gets used a lot. So it sometimes has trouble, and they're closing it to fix it.
Let me ask it a different way. Why was the Washington Monument built?
To commemorate George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army and the first American president.
Okay, so you can see now the student actually knows in some great detail the answer to the question that Natasha wanted the student to answer. So you can see again here that I don't know what you would have written. I'm not sure that's what I would have thought was what she was going for, but that's fine. As long as you came up with a response where you said something like you sort of took the responsibility yourself for the problem, and then you came up with a different question, maybe this one, maybe something else, and then you use that information to ask the question in a different way so the student has an opportunity to respond in a correct way if you're not getting what you want, but you realize it might be your responsibility. Okay, so let's look at a lesson. Our lead teacher, Ms. Pollack, is going to demonstrate a geometry lesson about shape properties. Here's her objective: to identify polygons or pentagons. Let's see two ways that she does this, one better than the other. So go ahead and watch the video, and we'll come back together, and we'll talk about the ways in which the different ways she did this were better and worse.
Today, we'll be learning about quadrilaterals. A quadrilateral is a polygon with 4 sides. Show me on your fingers. How many sides does a quadrilateral have? You told me how many sides a quadrilateral has, but I asked you to show me on your fingers. Can you show me on your fingers how many sides a quadrilateral has? 4, that's right. A quadrilateral has 4 sides. Liza, Tell me an example of a quadrilateral, or a shape that is a polygon with 4 sides. A square, that's right. A square is an example of a shape that's a quadrilateral, or a polygon with 4 sides. Well done. Now, who can come up to the board and draw an example of a quadrilateral? Jeffrey, you want to try it? Great, come on up. Excellent work. A square is an example of a quadrilateral, and you drew a square. This is a quadrilateral because it has 4 sides. Nice drawing of a quadrilateral. Well done. My last question is, who can tell me why this shape is a quadrilateral? Jack, why is this shape an example of a quadrilateral? Let's take a step back here. Let me ask this a different way. Remember, a quadrilateral is a polygon with 4 sides. So this shape is a quadrilateral because it is a polygon with 1, 2, 3, 4 sides. So why is this shape a quadrilateral? Because it has 4 sides. That's right. This shape is a quadrilateral because it has 4 sides. Today, we'll be learning about quadrilaterals. A quadrilateral is a polygon with 4 sides. Show me on your fingers. How many sides does a quadrilateral have? I asked you to show me on your fingers, not say it out loud. Try again. Who can tell me an example of a shape that is a quadrilateral? Nice job, you're right. Good work. Now everyone, please take out your whiteboards and draw an example of a shape that is a quadrilateral. Most students are drawing something like this. Nice job, everyone. Lastly, Sarah, can you come up here and tell me, or can you give me an explanation, why is this shape an example of a quadrilateral? Can anyone else help us out here? Can anyone else help us?
So, it's an interesting video. As you know, Ms. Pollock did a good job of really differentiating the better and the worse. So let's talk about the worse. I'm sure you had some reactions to that. There is a number of serious concerns about the way that the teacher handled that. So one thing was the teacher just gave negative feedback. Sarah said, no, that's the wrong answer. Another was that the teacher, when the student was going on, she said, whoa, 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 which is not very reinforcing for the student at all. That has the opposite consequence. It's not that gentle way I was describing. The teacher said my least favorite phrase, which is, you're so smart. And so these are the kinds of behaviors that we saw from Ms. Pollock that are problematic in trying to increase students' cognitive processing and keep them focused when they need support, when they need corrective feedback. Then you saw some really good examples of how she provided that specific praise. That's another thing she hadn't done in the first video, or in the negative video, was she didn't provide specific praise. She just said things like good. In the other example, you saw her do a range of things that are essentially the opposite of what she did when she did it poorly. So it's a nice example of contrasting different ways of doing things. It may have seemed obvious to you that like, oh yeah, like those are totally worse, but it might not have seemed as obvious to you before we talked about all these things. So a nice example there. Okay, so now you have an opportunity to stop and jot here and think about your own teaching. There are two kind of key things I want you to think about here. One, I want you to think about the specific feedback. How often do you provide the specific feedback we've been talking about, whether it's affirmative or corrective? And then I want you to think down here about how often you provide feedback in the way we've discussed here. You may not provide reset feedback that often, but when the question here is really not how often does it happen, but the question is when it happens, when something happens like the student goes on for a long time or they get off topic, how often do you, in those situations, use an effective form of reset feedback like we've discussed in this module? And the same thing with the affirmative feedback. When there are opportunities to provide affirmative feedback, how often do you provide the kind of affirmative feedback we talked about here? and the same thing for corrective. When you need corrective feedback, what percentage of the time that you do that, do you do it the way we described in this module? This is a nice opportunity for you to think about your own practice and how well you apply some of these skills. And I think you're going to find that some of these things you probably do really well, and there might be places where you can do a little bit better. So go ahead and rate yourself on these to give your sense of yourself, sort of thoughts about this, and then come back together. Okay, so now you have an exciting opportunity here. We're going to analyze a curriculum example yet again, because it's a great opportunity for you to think about how in your secondary prevention program that's already a complete program, how are you going to respond to students when they make mistakes, or when they get the right answer, or when you need to get them back on track? Because programs often do not specify all these things. They might specify the corrective feedback. That is somewhat common. But they rarely do these two things. And if they're not there, you need to be ready to respond. And that's where you need to bring in these explicit instruction principles of providing corrective feedback and affirmative and reset feedback. Now, so in your workbook, what you're going to get to do is you're going to get to look at an actual curriculum. And we're going to have the lesson right there for you. And then we've given you some sample responses. And what we'd like you to do is to think about how could you respond to each of these different things using the different ways of listening, different ways of providing feedback that we've talked about in this module. So go ahead and look at that workbook example, and then we'll come back together and we'll talk about it. Okay, I hope you had fun with that one. I think this is kind of an interesting one to get to do. That's just me, but maybe you didn't. But I think this is a cool one. So, all right, so let's talk about each of these. And I'm going to tell you an example I might give. You might have chosen a different one, and that's fine. So here we need corrective feedback. This isn't correct. Now, the student is writing this, not saying this. But I think this right here is a good opportunity to do a form of reset feedback a form of corrective feedback where you are revoicing. Okay? Now, it's revoicing, but sort of like revoicing what was written, right? So what I might say here is something like, so I see that you underline the base word and circled the ending, and K is in both of them. Is that what you meant to do? And the student might say, oh, no, I just meant to circle the ED. So that might be a good example of how you could handle that one. Okay, the next one. So student has circled the DING or the IDING, and actually IDING. So here, the student is relatively off here, and I think, though, that this might be an example where I give a really quick response, and I would say, so this is deciding. In deciding, the ending is ing. What's the ending? Ing. If I had some sort of wall in the room where I had a list of affixes, I might say, if I look at the affix wall, I can see ing is an ending. So what is the ending? Ing. Good. Go ahead and circle it. So then the student is getting that feedback. I said good. I went and reinforced that. I probably could have said, go ahead and, what could I have done better? I said, go ahead and circle that. What could I have said instead? I could have said, go ahead and circle ing, getting in their head one more time the correct kind of answer. Okay, let's go on to the next one. So this says Hunts because it's H-U-N-T-S, and if I read those sounds together, it says Hunts. Now, so this is a student totally misunderstanding what they're supposed to be doing. And by the time the student gets here, I realize they're not understanding the task. So how can I get the student back on track? So we get to about this point, I've realized we need to do that. So I think to myself, how am I going to handle that? What I'm going to do is I'm going to nod and say, okay, that is how you sound that out. That is how you spell it. So let's think now about what is the ending in Hunts. Okay? And so now I've had an opportunity to gently sort of stop the student. I've done my hand motions. Probably you did not do the hand motions as you're writing your workbook, or perhaps you drew a little stick figure, or you just sort of wrote down. I would do the sort of gentle, the little gentle thing. And so that might be a way to do the reset feedback there. Okay, here we have what? A correct response, right? So I would say something like this. So I noticed that you circled the ending S. So you have the S for the for this. So you got the S for this verb, and it's the third person. It's the third person ending for this for the verb spot, which is how it's used here. And so I like how you look carefully at the ending and circled the S, which is the correct ending. Or I could focus on the base word. I could say, I like how you underline the base word spot in this example. You are looking carefully for the base word. Nice job underlining the base word spot. And so now I've had multiple opportunities to get the student more praise about that. I probably wouldn't have gone on as long with the student. I might have said really quickly, like, I like how you focus on the base word and underline the base word spot, and then moved right on because they don't need me to go on and on about it. Okay, so let's look at this other one here. Well, I think for this one that we have to underline, here we go on and on and on. And so here we have another example of a case where we need to do some reset feedback. And so I might gently here, let's see. Well, I think for this one, we have to underline the base word. So if we look at spotting, so the student is going on sort of trying to get at the right answer. So in this situation, I need to make a decision whether or not to stop the student or let them continue to think it out. And it's a judgment call here. The student is really trying to process this information. So I might actually continue to let them go on for another sentence or so, another 3 to 5 seconds, to see if they sort of get in the right direction. And if they do, great. And if not, I would nod and I would say, okay, hang on a second. So I say, okay, and then hang on a second, just sort of gentle language to say sort of, like we're going to stop, but it's not going to be, a problem. We're just going to, just for a second, we're going to hang on for a second. And I put up a finger just like sort of like this so I can see, like, they can see that I'm not trying to stop them like this. It's just a finger. And so that would be a gentle way to do that. Okay, final one, carries here. So now I'm going to use probably the most complicated form of corrective feedback, which is the sort of agreeing and then giving the student an opportunity, a choice to give them an opportunity to respond after you give them the right information. So you can see here, I agree, what we agree with? I agree that S is an ending. In this word, when we have carry, we change the Y to an I and we add ES. So the ending is ES. So you tell me, is the ending S or is the ending ES? The student has the opportunity to say ES. And I might repeat the whole thing. I might say, that's right, the ending is ES. With carry, we change the Y to an I, correct? And then we add what? ES. Excellent work. And so then I give that affirmative feedback there again at the end. And I've explained the whole thing again, even including the Y example, getting in their head yet again the correct answer. So what a nice example of all the different things you can do. At least I thought it's a nice example. Kind of fun to think about that, at least for me. So I hope you enjoyed the opportunity to kind of think about these different ways to do that. So now, let's look at a real situation yet again. I really like looking at these videos. I like a lot of these things, as you can tell. I really like looking at these videos because it really gives us a clear example of how to apply this to our own practice. And I hope that this is giving you some thoughts about how you can do some of these things. So let's look at this video example and look at whether Ms. O provides students with immediate specific feedback. So let's go ahead and watch this video and decide how she does.
Ready? Okay, remember we've been talking about syllables, and syllables are parts of the word, okay?
Okay.
Remember, the words are broken down, so I want you to watch me. I'm going to say the word flower, okay? Now, can you say flower?
Flower.
Okay, now we're going to break flower apart. Flower. Okay, now watch. Are you watching? I'm going to blend it back together. Flower. Okay.
Flower.
Right, now let's read flower. Okay, now I'm going to let you try. Okay, so I'm going to give you the cards. I want you to line up the cards together. All right. Okay, so they're together. Ready? The word is monkey. Say monkey.
Monkey.
Okay, separate the word by syllable.
Monkey.
Okay, now blend it back together.
Monkey.
Okay, say turtle.
Turtle.
Okay, let's break it apart.
Turtle.
Okay, let's blend it back together.
Turtle.
Great job. Let's try apple.
Apple.
Okay, let's blend it back together.
Apple.
Good job. Let's try the word puppet. First syllable, pup.
Puppet.
Okay, blend it back together.
Puppet.
Okay, and let's try apple. Ready, go.
Apple.
No, wait, we're going too fast. Let's try again. First syllable,
Apple.
Second syllable, pull. Let's blend it back together.
Apple.
Okay, watch me. Apple. Apple. Let's try together. Ready? First syllable.
Apple.
Second syllable. Pull. Blend it together.
Apple.
Good job. Okay, anything?
Okay, so let's talk about that example. So a nice example of some teacher giving some feedback. Okay, so let's take a look now. Let's think about Ms. O's example there. I think that's a great example of a good lesson where the teacher is eliciting a lot of responses from students, which we know is really important. The students are with her throughout the lesson. The teacher is doing a great job. She has this very positive affect that I think is reinforcing alone for the students. In addition, she does a good job of consistently providing immediate feedback. She does it in a number of ways. She occasionally says good, but one thing she says all the time is just okay. She does it in a very nice way that makes it feel a little bit reinforcing, like okay, you got it, okay, you got it, right? It's a very subtle way of saying okay in a positive tone, which I really thought was quite good. So that's all very good at being immediate, but it's not great at being specific. Now, you could say in a lot of the cases here, we don't need specific feedback. The students are with her, the okay is adequate to move on to the next example. She's not even bothering to try to get into the good kind of thing. There was a place where I think it would have been beneficial for the teacher to provide more immediate, more specific feedback. So, what was that example? Where was it that that could have been helpful? I would say that the place that would have been more helpful would have been with the word apple. The students struggled to do it. They ultimately got it after the teacher started over, retaught that little example, but she could have given more corrective and affirmative feedback at the end by doing something like, when you hear a and pull, you can put those together and say apple. So, what happens when you put a and pull together? It says what, everyone? Apple. Great job. A and pull say apple. So we get another opportunity to correct the students and very specifically give them that praise about what they did correctly once they got the correct answer. And I think this is a great example. Again, as I've said, this is a good lesson. So I'm not saying, I do lots of lessons where I always know I can improve. This is a great lesson. I like the way the teacher does many things here, but we can see how in some instances she could have gone just a little bit further. And that's what this module is all about. Not saying people's practice is bad. It's about saying, how can we, using our checklist that we've talked about, increase the quality of our practice to maximize student engagement so we have maximum processing of the content. So, but given that we just talked about how we could do this differently, let's think about how you might adapt this instruction. I've given you some ideas, but I want you to think about it on your own. What's important here is to think about adapting the instruction. So remember that the whole point of this explicit instruction module is to help you think about, even when you have a program, even when you know how you're teaching, to think about how can you increase the level at which you're doing the explicit instruction by, in this case, providing more specific feedback. So when you are looking at students who aren't responding to your instruction, you might realize that many of the things you do in your explicit instruction are quite good, but you might realize, I'm not providing specific feedback. And I find that when I look at the students' work samples, they are getting things wrong that I feel like I've talked about. And maybe if I'd been more specific in my feedback, the students wouldn't have made those mistakes. So this is where we can use the adaptation process to help us think about how we can improve our instruction. So think about this. How might you adapt this instruction? So go ahead and think about that. And then when you're finished, we'll come back together and we'll start to wrap up this part of the module. Okay, now you have a chance to think about sort of how you would have adapted that lesson, which is an exciting opportunity for you to bring this back to database individualization. Let's close with some important things here. Let's close with two important things. So let's first talk about the discussion board post. The goal here is for you to respond to one of the three questions below with a correct, incorrect, or off-topic response. And you're going to just indicate in your discussion board which one of these you responded to, obviously, and then what the response is. And what's exciting about this example, I'm telling you it's all very exciting, is that now you have an opportunity to respond to a student, to someone else and say, aha, I know what you're doing there. You're trying to give this kind of feedback or whatever. So, and you then can give them that specific feedback based on the incorrect response. So you have two jobs. One, you come up with some correct, incorrect, and off-topic responses to one of these prompts. And then 2, you go online, you look at some other folks' examples, use the discussion board in the way we've talked about already. You can read again for yourself, and then you're going to respond to other people by writing the kind of feedback you would provide. So a really fun opportunity to think more about how to do this stuff. And let me just say one thing, which is that when you do this, avoid doing things that are sort of like problematic. Make it relatively easy for people to figure out what you're trying to do. Although at the reset feedback, you could write a whole paragraph and use that as an example of when you need to stop students. Okay, so that's the discussion board. Last thing here is the quiz. So you're going to have an opportunity to do a quiz about all the feedback, and then you can watch the quiz video at the end to see what I thought the answers were. So enjoy the quiz. I mean, I think you're going to enjoy it. You're going to love it. It's going to be fun, an opportunity to practice. So enjoy that opportunity. We'll come back together if you want to watch the quiz answer video so you can get some feedback about what I think the correct answers are. Okay, so let's look at the answers, and I'll tell you what I think the right answers would have been. Which of the following is not a method for providing corrective feedback? So if you look at all of these, the one that isn't correct is reinforce and restate, because you use that when you are doing what kind of feedback? That's for affirmative feedback. So you wouldn't do that as for corrective feedback. You're reinforcing what the student said, which means they gave the right answer. True or false? If a student gives off-topic response to a question, the teacher should provide reset feedback. And that is true. The whole idea of reset feedback is to set it, stop us, reset what we're doing, and we'll go back right into the lesson so we can keep ourselves on track. Next, let's look at Ms. L's example here. And she is teaching a reading lesson about decoding, as you know. So let's look at the type of feedback that she might be giving in each of these instances, and you can name which it is. So, what feedback the teacher should provide. So let's just read each of these. Today we will learn how to read words with prefixes re and on. Who can remind me what a prefix is? Student says a group of letters that come before the root word. And is that correct? Yes, so that would be affirmative feedback. Second here, this is the prefix re. When re appears at the beginning of a word, it usually means again, point to the word replay. Louis read the word, and the student says relay. So this requires corrective feedback. Point to the word redo. Alec, read the word. Student says redo. So here again, affirmative feedback. And finally, point to the word resize. Abby, read the word. Student starts to go off in this direction. And it's the only one you haven't said so far, which is the reset feedback. We need to find a way to get Allie back on track. Okay, next we have Ms. B. And here we're thinking about the level of complexity of the skill. Remember at the beginning of this section I said something about the fact that sometimes a skill is complex and you can't give that feedback right away. If students are writing a paragraph, you may need to wait until they finish part of the paragraph, versus discrete things where there are individual pieces that you can provide feedback immediately with. So with this, let's look at Ms. B's example and think about whether or not she could provide discrete feedback, or it would be required for her to provide more complex feedback based on the design of the lesson. So today we'll learn about how to evaluate expressions with PEMDAS and so on. And expressions within blank should be solved first. Within exponents, it's not correct. It should be within parentheses. But that is an example where you could give discrete feedback because very quickly you know what the incorrect response is. So teacher, so if we have an expression, what will we do first? Student says 2 plus 5 equals 7 because we read left to right, so we have to do that first. So here, again, it could be discrete feedback because we can give that feedback right away. Same example here. We can see how the teacher would evaluate this expression because it's, again, a discrete example. And here is the one example where it's complex because the students are being asked to do 5 of them, and we can't very quickly right away give them the correct response. So you can see there lots of discrete examples, just one complex. And that's probably going to be the way it is in your classroom. Typically, I would recommend having a lot more opportunities for students to do little pieces before you ask to give them a huge big assignment or even a slightly longer assignment. Having them do things one at a time is a great way to practice, as we talked about when we talked about modeling and practice. So you've now finished the quiz. You've now completed part 1, this exciting module. You've now talked all about the different ways to provide specific feedback immediately that are going to help students do well in their lessons. And you're going to provide that reinforcement and that correction that's really going to help them. So great work with that. I'm ending with some very positive feedback here. Even though I can't see you, you're there. So it's great. Good job.